The intention this morning, like I said, is to finish what we started last time and walk through the rest of this important chapter, John 14. And to do that well, I recognize I'll first need to remind us of where we've been, because it's been a long week. And so let's do that quickly, and then we'll move on to new ground. I wish I had a TV voice to say this, but previously at First Baptist Church. Basically, the heart of John chapter 14 are those first 4 verses. Do not let your hearts be troubled. You believe in God, believe also in me, Jesus says. My Father's house has many rooms, and if that weren't so, would I have told you that I'm going there to prepare a place for you? And if I go and prepare a place for you, I'll come back and take you there to be with me, that you may be where I am. You know the way to the place where I'm going, Jesus says. Those are some familiar words, aren't they? They're words that we often quote, especially in our grief, especially when our hearts are troubled. And as I talked about last week, we tend to think about them primarily as a description of heaven, don't we? Jesus is consoling his friends just before his death, and it seems like he's doing that by reminding them that there's this other place somewhere that he's going to. And he's going to go prepare it, and they shouldn't worry because this place has enough room for them. The subtext being, at least, that the troubling things that they're experiencing now as this small band of friends, the warnings they've heard about betrayal and the denial of Jesus and the departure of Jesus, going somewhere where they can't follow, all of that will be addressed someday, somehow, when he comes again and he provides them with this miraculous, grand escape from the world to the heavenly mansion, which feels straightforward and it feels intuitive. But the problem that I talked about last Sunday is that I'm not so convinced that's what Jesus means at all. I think, given the conversation that ensues and the questions that Thomas and Philip interject, I think that what Jesus is really doing here is talking about himself and the way that he is the only life and the only truth that can be of any consolation in this world when we're faced with troubled hearts. I see in his reference to his Father's house not so much a description of heaven, but a very bold claim about the presence of God and the way that this presence will no longer be limited to one place like it was at the temple, but will be spread out and made radically more accessible. So rather than assuming that these many rooms are places for us, maybe these are places for God to dwell with us. And along those same lines, Jesus' work of preparation isn't so much the work of constructing heaven, which would be something that we could only speculate about, but it's the work that he's about to take upon himself in his death and resurrection. That's the work that's required in order to secure these promises. I know that's a lot to chew on, but essentially what I wanted to say is that I don't think Jesus is giving his eulogy here, nor is he holding up heaven and eternity as the main consolation of the gospel, the carrot. Instead, he's exalting himself as the only viable hope that there is. He's not just a means to attain something better, but he's the only way, and he's the only life, and he's the only truth, which means that it's in him somehow that this new presence of God is made available, that this new thing happens. That's what he's trying to teach us. And today, we need to pick up where we left off, there in verse 15, and finish this train of thought, because there's some important questions that still need answering. You might not have felt the cliffhanger at the end of last Sunday, but there are some things that we need to address. And the first, the most important, is if Jesus is going away, which is one of the things that he's told his disciples, why does he choose to console him with himself? Why does he think it's comforting to locate life and truth in him and in the same breath admit that he won't be around? How is that consolation? It's confusing enough for the disciples who heard these words firsthand, those who are troubled, as a reminder, precisely because Jesus is leaving. But it goes for you and I too, because if, more generally speaking, the consolation of the gospel is Jesus and no other thing. then how is that a comfort for us when he hasn't been here for 2,000 years? What does it look like for us to experience Jesus in this interim, not the interim at First Baptist Church, but this much, much bigger interim? Second question, and this is a bit more self-centered, but it's important. What does God require of us if he's going to comfort us in this way? Maybe to put it differently, are there conditions for this consolation that Jesus intends to give? And if so, what exactly are those conditions? I held off from asking about that last time because I didn't want Jesus' encouraging words, Jesus' peaceful way of coming up to us and saying, do not let your hearts be troubled. I didn't want that to be swallowed up in exhortation, in a list of do's and don'ts. So I tried to hold that at bay. But if you skim the Gospels, you'll see a lot of instruction there, right? About how we're supposed to live. So what does all of that have to do with the comfort that Jesus is providing here? Do we have to do anything to receive it? If there's a bargain happening, what do we need to do to keep our end of it? And then the final question, which I imagine many of you have thought about already, even this morning, is this. Is Jesus talking at all about heaven here in John 14? And that's putting it mildly. That's extending you benefit of the doubt, because I know in reality, some of you would probably be more direct and ask, is Reed actually right when he says that the main consolation of the gospel, as it's described here in John 14, isn't heaven? Because heaven sounds pretty good, doesn't it? Why shouldn't that be something that we long for? Why isn't that good enough? And really, even after everything I've said, some might believe that these verses still feel like they teach us about heaven, even if that's secondary or if it's hidden. So that's the final thing we need to discuss. Does heaven even factor into Jesus' consolation at all? And I've used that word consolation, but all I have in mind is the goal, the goodness of the good news, the thing that we're looking forward to. And if I've been careful in my interpretation of this text, which I've tried to be, then it's true that I've staved off heaven as the main hope of Christianity in favor of upholding Jesus and him alone. But we need to ask before we wrap things up, is there any room at all for heaven? Is there hope for heaven? And does that factor in here? Those are some big questions, I know, but let me read our text together and then we'll get to work. So follow along if you can. And this is, again, the Gospel of John, chapter 14, and we'll pick things up in verse 15. If you love me, Jesus says, keep my commands. And I will ask the Father, and he will give you another advocate to help you and be with you forever, the Spirit of truth. The world cannot accept him because it neither sees him nor knows him, but you know him, for he lives with you and will be in you. I won't leave you as orphans. I'll come to you. Before long, the world won't see me anymore, but you will see me. Because I live, you also will live. And on that day, you will realize that I am in my Father, and you are in me, and I am in you. Whoever has my commands and keeps them is the one who loves me. The one who loves me will be loved by my Father, and I too will love them and show myself to them. Then Judas, not Judas Iscariot, said, but Lord, why do you intend to show yourself to us and not to the world? And Jesus replied, anyone who loves me will obey my teaching. My Father will love them, and I will come to them and make our home with them. Anyone who does not love me will not obey my teaching. These words you hear aren't my own. They belong to the Father who sent me. All this I've spoken while I'm still with you. But the advocate, the Holy Spirit, whom the Father will send in my name, will teach you all things and will remind you of everything that I've said to you. Peace I leave you. My peace I give you. I don't give to you as the world gives. Do not let your hearts be troubled and do not be afraid. You heard me say I'm going away and I'm coming back to you. If you loved me, you'd be glad that I'm going to the Father, for the Father is greater than I. I told you now before it happens, so that when it does happen, you'll believe. I will not say much more to you, for the prince of this world is coming. He has no hold over me, but he comes so that the world may learn that I love the Father and do exactly what my Father has commanded me. Come now, let us leave. I'd like to organize our thoughts this morning under those three questions that I brought up, and somehow I have to boil them down so that they can become sermon notes, which is really hard. So let me put them in the most abbreviated form that I can. The first question is, if Jesus is going away, how can he console us with himself? Make sense? Second question, are there conditions for receiving this consolation that Jesus is going to give us? And then third, which is the simplest, what about heaven? That's the plan. So first up, if Jesus is going away, how can he console us with himself? And remember, that's the central paradox here, just beneath the surface of John 14. Everyone knows he's going away. Maybe even a couple in the room have put it together that he really does intend to die. That's still in question, but he's going away, and Jesus consoles them with essentially saying that he is the only truth and the only life. And that presents us with a problem, because that is not comforting at all if he's got one foot out the door already. And yet it's a remarkably easy paradox to answer, actually. It's easy, it's not simple, but look at verse 16. And I will ask the Father, Jesus says, and he will give you another advocate to help you and be with you forever, the Spirit of truth. So that's the answer. It's the Spirit, or at least that's the short answer. It's clearly where Jesus has been heading all along from the beginning of this chapter. And he starts by giving the Spirit a name. He calls him the Paraclete, which is nothing like parakeet, just so you know. It is a famously difficult word to translate. And we've been reading the NIV, which translates it advocate. But other versions, maybe your version that you're looking at now, uses different titles like counselor or comforter. I love the word companion. Some even call him the strengthener or the intercessor, the helper. If we take all those options together, then I think we can get some idea of the force of that original word, which is a little bit big. All of them point to the fact that the Spirit has this particular role to fulfill, right? Which is true to Jesus' theme all along. It seems to be directed towards a kind of comfort, a kind of intimate presence in the here and now. In fact, if you look down at verse 27, that's how Jesus wraps up his description of the Spirit. The net result of Jesus' departure will be peace. Peace I leave with you, he says. My peace I give to you. I don't give to you as the world gives. Do not let your hearts be troubled, and do not be afraid. And that's why this is a part 2, right? Because that phrase occurs in the second half of this chapter again. By sending the Spirit, Jesus is giving us peace. And going back to verse 16, he tells them that this advocate will be with them forever. Later on in the gospel, he actually says that it's better that he leave. You'll know this. In chapter 16, he says to his disciples after his resurrection, you're filled with grief because I've said these things. But very truly I tell you, it is for your good that I'm going away. Unless I go away, the advocate, the paraclete, won't come to you. But if I go, I'll send him to you. So what exactly are the benefits of the Spirit? If this is where the trail leads, what are the benefits as Jesus lays them out here for us? Well, he assures his disciples that the Spirit will help them and teach them all things and remind them of everything that he's taught them. So basically, when Jesus leaves, the Spirit will stand in as a kind of mediator, someone who will serve to bind them to Jesus and his ways. Did you catch that he'll be another advocate? So presumably in the pattern of the original advocate, the Son. But I actually think there's more going on here, because if you look back at verse 17, Jesus said that the Spirit will live with and actually be in them. And that's a much different kind of benefit, isn't it? It's not just that the Spirit will encounter us from the outside and provide us information and insight about Jesus, but more than that, he'll reside in us. And so the work of helping and teaching and reminding, those will become subjective activities of the Spirit within the disciples, which is very different from the objective activities of Jesus that these 11 have only observed by this point. So there's a paradigm shift happening here where the disciples' relationship with Jesus that has so far been something external, like every other relationship with any other thing, is now becoming something internal. And hopefully you can start to see at this point the way all of this is coming together, because the red thread that we've tracked multiple times has been that idea of dwelling or residing. We've talked a lot about houses. The best word for it is abiding. Remember, originally it was the Father's house, and then it was Jesus taking us to be with him wherever he goes, where he dwells. And now it's the Spirit who will live not just with us, but within us. Jesus says that he will make his home with us. That's a remarkable kind of progression. And it's something that will actually only continue in chapter 15 when Jesus talks about the vine and the branches, right? What does he tell us to do? To abide in him, to dwell with him. This whole post-dinner conversation has been about presence. And now he's declared that God's Spirit will be the way that he dwells with us, even when he can't be physically present. But let's cut to the chase. If the disciples were worried that their Lord is leaving, which practically is the trouble, then his encouragement to them is that when he does, the presence of God will remain with them through the Spirit. And that is good news for us too, isn't it? The Spirit is the means by which we know Jesus in the here and in the now. He's the one who communicates Jesus. The means by which we're made contemporaries with Jesus. If you're wondering how you can have a relationship with someone who's been gone for 2,000 years, it's here. This is him. And notice the word I used there. He's a means, which is a word that I really fought hard against last week when we were talking about Jesus, because Jesus is decidedly not a means, but the Spirit is not the Son. And in fact, the work of the Spirit is the work of making the Son known. We don't talk much about the Spirit as Baptists, I know. But we should, because, friends, the Spirit isn't just someone to blame when miracles happen or when we suddenly have prophetic insight. He's not the sum total of everything that's enigmatic about the Christian faith. He's also not an excuse that we can leverage when we're in doubt or when we're in need or when we really want to justify our opinion about what should happen, when we need a divine sanction. No, the Spirit, as it says in verse 26, is sent by the Father in Jesus' name. Did you catch that? His work in us is to mediate Jesus. The world cannot accept him, Jesus says, because it neither sees him nor knows him, but you know him, for he lives with you and will be in you. Then listen to this, verse 18. This is a remarkable phrase. I will not leave you as orphans. I will come to you. Before long, the world won't see me anymore. I won't be here, but you will see me. And because I live, you also will live. The reason we'll see Jesus, even when he's gone, and the reason that the world won't, is because the Spirit will make him visible to us. The Spirit's presence in us will make Jesus' presence with us real and tangible in the here and now, in this very moment, even when he's currently sitting at the right hand of the Father in glory, which is what we've all professed to be true. That's the best way I can put it. And so it's worth asking, before we move on, is this how the Spirit feels? In your daily lived existence, and your faith as a Christian, does having the Spirit feel like having Jesus with you wherever you go? I used that word subjective earlier, and I meant it because the Spirit's work, if Jesus is right, is something interior to us. Something very different than our experiences of reading Scripture or singing songs or attending church or practicing disciplines. Those are all outside of us. Those are things that we do, things that happen to us, but the Spirit is inside. And so there's something mysterious happening here There's some way that he's tangled up in our own perspective. But even in that messiness, he is the main consolation of John 14. And so, does he feel like it? Do you agree with Jesus that it's better to have them than to have Jesus the Christ walking around with you in the flesh or sitting next to you in the pew? Because this is the consolation that he gives. You know, another passage that comes to mind here is from the Old Testament, the book of Jeremiah, chapter 31. Verses 33 and 34, it says, "This is the covenant I will make with the people of Israel after that time," describes the Lord. He's talking about the covenant to come, the new covenant. "I will put my law in their minds and write it on their hearts." You see the way that that's interior language. It used to be that you could go touch the stone tablet. You can't do that anymore. Now it's inside. Then listen to this because it's remarkable. "No longer will they teach their neighbor or say to one another, 'Know the Lord,' because they will all know me, from the least of them to the greatest." Far from being limited to the functions of a decoder ring or a photo album or a journal, the Spirit is not a mnemonic. He's not something that just gives us information and insight about Jesus. No, the Spirit gives us Jesus as he is. We actually come to know Jesus when the Spirit abides with us. And the reason that the Spirit is capable of doing all of that is because he's God. He is the Spirit of Jesus. And so when he's given and when he takes up residence with us, it's not a stretch to say that we quite literally become dwelling places for God. Okay, second question. Are there any conditions for receiving this consolation of Jesus? In other words, what must we do if we're to receive this wonderful thing called the Spirit? And the reason I ask is mostly because there's a few comments here in John 14 that feel a bit out of place, at least initially, right? The first happens immediately, right out of the gate, at the beginning of our section today, verse 15. Almost out of the blue, Jesus says, "If you love me, keep my commands." And he says it again in verse 21, "Whoever has my commands and keeps them is the one who loves me." Verse 23, "Anyone who loves me will obey my teaching." He's saying this any way he knows how, right? Verse 24, "Anyone who does not love me will not obey my teaching." Why is he so concerned all of a sudden with talking about obedience and love? That hasn't been part of the conversation in this chapter at all thus far. So when it appears here, it's difficult for us to see any kind of connection. And this is hard. This is tough. But I think the key is maybe found in what's not said directly. We assume, or I can say I assumed, that all these references to love and obedience have the force of kind of legal conditions, requirements that Jesus is asserting over and against his disciples as prerequisites to receive the Spirit. As if he was saying, if you want this abiding presence when I'm gone, then you have to measure up in these specific ways. You have to check these boxes. But it's more likely, I think, that Jesus isn't questioning his disciples' love for him or demanding that they do so. Hey, love me, remember? But rather he's assuming it. Remember, these 11 men have grown to love him deeply. And in fact, the whole point of this chapter is that their hearts are troubled because he's leaving. And so it's not something that he's trying to demand again from them. It's something evident. Their hearts are troubled because they love Jesus and he's gone. And so instead, I think what this chapter is trying to drive home is the way that love that is already innate relates to obedience. And this is an invitation more than a kind of imperative, which means the force is something more like, I know you love me, and if you do, then you'll do what I ask you to do. You see what I mean? And if that's the case, then the connection between the train of thought that we've been following all along about the presence of Jesus and this Spirit coming all starts to become a lot clearer, because he says in verse 26 that the Holy Spirit will teach them all things and will remind them of everything he's said to them, even these commands, right? The Spirit is there not just to communicate the presence of Jesus, but to empower the believer to obey Jesus. So what does Jesus command? Well, here in John, I think there are two really big things that he commands. And the first is found in the first verse of this chapter, where he says that we're to believe in him. You believe in God, believe also in me. And then the second is actually one that Stacy helped us learn today because she sang about it. It comes in chapter 13, verses 34 and 35. A new command I give to you. Love one another. As I have loved you, so you must love one another. By this, everyone will know that you are my disciples, if you love one another. I think these things could be rephrased. If I were to put them in my own words, this first command to believe in Jesus is really a command to allow ourselves to be loved by Jesus, because that's what it looks like to trust him, right? To acknowledge his love for us, to receive it. You remember when Jesus is washing the feet of his disciples and Peter's like, you're not going to wash my feet. And what does Jesus say? I'm absolutely going to wash your feet, because if I don't, you have no part with me. It's this idea that to be a disciple is we can't bypass receiving the kind of service that Jesus wants to give us. We have to believe it. And then the second command is a lot simpler, right? If we're to receive the love of God, then what are we also supposed to do? We're supposed to give it. And it's actually in this giving of love that we make people aware that we're followers of him. John, as a writer, loves to talk about love. And about this new word. If you read his epistles, he's always talking about this new word, this new command. The new word happened a chapter ago in chapter 13. Do you remember the new thing that Jesus taught us? To love one another. And whenever he talks about love, he talks also about the Spirit, because the Spirit is the one who makes this love possible. So in his second epistle, 2 John, verse 6, he says, and this is love, that we walk in obedience to his commands. Sounds a lot like what we're reading now, right? And you've heard from the beginning, his command is that you walk in love. In 1 John chapter 2, verses 3 and 6, he says again, we know that we have come to know him. You hear that phrase? We know that we have come to know him. We can be sure that we know who he is if we keep his commands. Whoever says, I know him, but does not do what he commands, is a liar, and the truth is not in that person. But if anyone obeys his word, love for God is truly made complete in him. This is how we know we are in him. Whoever claims to live in him must live as Jesus did, which is to love enemy and to love neighbor. Last week we talked about truth, right? Because Jesus is the only truth. But notice, if you can, when he says the truth is not in that person, he's not assuming that we're dumb and that we need a definition of what it means to be a liar. He's not just spilling ink. Ink is expensive, right? No, he's saying that those without him are devoid of truth. They are existentially made liars. In our passage for today, verse 17, we see that the Spirit isn't just our advocate. He's the Spirit of what? He's the Spirit of truth. So to be disobedient and to fail to love, which is Jesus' principal command, is in actuality to be without the presence of Jesus. It's to fail to have the Spirit residing within us. All right, one more question to answer, and then we're golden. What about heaven? It seems like I have worked tirelessly the past 2 weeks to free this chapter from what I've argued, in any way I know how, is a shallow, speculative interpretation, but one that has dominated the church's reading of this passage for a long, long time. We have stubbornly stuck with the first 4 verses of this word in isolation from the rest, and we've decided to console ourselves with eschatology, with talk about the end, with talk about the redemption of all things, about where we're going, about what's going to happen there at the very end of things. And we've done that at the expense of pneumatology. Talk of the Spirit and the work of the Spirit within us. So the final question on the table is basically whether I have been right and whether heaven factors in here at all. Does it have a place here in John 14? Does Jesus hold heaven up as any kind of good news for us? And one way to broach that question is actually to look really closely at Judas's interjection in verse 22. And remember, this isn't Judas Iscariot. Judas Iscariot is off in the night. He is currently betraying Jesus as we speak. Now, this is a different Judas, and we're not sure. Maybe he's Jude. He could be James, the brother of Jesus. It's not really important right now. What's important is this question. Lord, why do you intend to show yourself to us and not to the world? If you're like me, you read that question 15 times and had no idea what he was trying to ask. But it's important because so far, Jesus' comments have led to a very small, particular subset of people in the world receiving the Spirit. In fact, the original disciples could be forgiven that they are really the only inheritors of this word. Hey, I'm going away, but you 12 are going to receive the Spirit of God, and I'm going to be with you. And so Judas is confused because if Jesus' claim about being the Messiah is true, if Jesus isn't just a really good rabbi, then his presence in the world can't just be something that a select group of people acknowledge, not when he knows that the Messiah is the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords, and in the end, every knee will bow, not just the 11 people in this room. And so really this question, if we're to put it in our words, is like ours. If the indwelling of the Spirit is all there is, then Jesus, what about the redemption of the world? Isn't it the case, Jesus, that we're waiting for something that won't just be the private experiences of the Spirit in a relative few? You can hear our question. Isn't it the case, Jesus, that won't be just the private experiences of people in the church? Isn't there something for the world as well? Isn't it about the public annunciation of God's kingdom to all people? Basically, what about heaven, Jesus? What's the answer? And the clue comes, I think, in verse 20, because Jesus says, on that day, you will realize that I am in my Father and you are me and I am in you. And I think that's fundamentally important because it seems like there are 2 days in view here. There's a double meaning. And the first relates to the subject that we've been talking about all along. It's the day that the Spirit arrives on the scene. It's when Jesus, after he does this excruciating, literally excruciating work of preparing, it's when the Spirit is given and when he breathes on his disciples and imparts to them this presence that will remain with them forever. But the second day is also true there because he does talk about coming again, right? Because he's not left us as orphans. And so that second day is different because it's when all of this is gathered up and brought to fruition. It's not as simple as saying that the Spirit's work here is provisional. And we need to be very careful of that. Because Jesus says that he'll be with us forever. And so I don't think it's fair to assume that the Spirit is just some stopgap measure. Nor is it fair for us to assume that he's somehow insufficient for us now. Oh, I'm going to give you something and it's going to tide you over. But the real thing is right around the corner. No, that's vitally important for us to see. Because the whole point of this passage, the main thrust has been very simply that you and I have tragically misunderstood the gospel if we believe that our faith is just a waiting game. It's not. Jesus is with us now. He's alive today. You and I can abide with him in this very moment. And actually, that abiding with him is the highest order of consolation we will ever receive as creatures. It doesn't get better. And so when he returns and when heaven arrives and when all things are made new, then it will be good, not because it's something different, but because it will be made complete. It's something we can only taste now. It's a seal, but it's something that we'll inhabit later. Let me try to conclude this wild ride. I hope you've seen just a little bit of how complex this chapter is, because you could spend a lifetime thinking about it. But rest assured, I don't intend to spend your lifetime right now thinking about it. Let me leave you with just 2 observations. And the first is hinted at here. And it's that heaven is not some other place. Rather than thinking about it as an escape, think about it instead as a final answer to the Lord's Prayer. A way that God is going to make good on our constant request of him that what's done in heaven, what's done in perfect accordance with his will, what's done in his presence will be done in the same way here. That's heaven. It's the presence of God coming to us, and it's not the presence of us going to God. There's more to say, much more to say, but you and me, we need to reclaim that kind of clarity. Redemption is about the renewal and the restoration of the world, and it's not about the abandonment of it. You don't get to fly away in the end to someplace else and think, oh, well, that was really fun. The Spirit's a foretaste. Second, the Spirit of God, as he reveals Jesus in that first day of the Lord, he sends us out on mission into the world. And I actually think this is maybe a more faithful way to interpret Jesus' response to Judas's question. Lord, why do you intend to show yourself to us and not to the world outside? And the answer is that Jesus intends for that to be our work. That's something that we do. That come, let us leave at the end of the chapter is really well placed, isn't it? Because it's Jesus very practically saying, I'm done with dinner. It's time to go to the garden. It's also Jesus gathering these 12 emissaries, these 12 friends, and saying, let's go into the world. In chapter 20, verses 21 and 22, you see all of this come to some kind of fruition because Jesus says, peace be with you. As the Father has sent me, I am sending you. And with that, he breathed on them, and he said, receive the Holy Spirit. Friends, Jesus' plan is that you and I will be the ones who carry this presence with us into the world via the Spirit.